Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Prom. I am Director of the EABCC Email Archiving Building Capacity and Community Project here at the University of Illinois. And I'd like to welcome you to the third and final day of our Email Archiving Symposium. We're really happy this morning to be welcoming guests from the National Archives, Archives Nationales in Paris, France, to provide some perspectives and an overview of the work that they are undertaking to archive mailboxes. And I'm really excited about this. I'm somewhat familiar with the work that's going on in other national archives, particularly here in the United States and in the United Kingdom and a few other countries, but I've never heard anything about what's happening in France. So I'm really pleased to be welcoming here this morning our two guests, who are Emeline Levasseur and André Falut. So thank you so much, Emeline and André, for being here. And I'm very happy to turn things over to you for this early morning Central Time presentation. And I understand later in the day presentation, obviously in France. So over to you, Emeline and André.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Here in France, in Paris, France, it's 3. So good afternoon. And it's quite a sunny, hot day, as you may not see. We are delighted to be part of this symposium and to be able to talk about mail archiving with you. And we'd like to thank the EABCC organization team for having us. Let me introduce André and myself. We are both project managers for data migration and responsible for the digital preservation strategy at the Archives Nationales, so the French National Archives. The reason we're here today is to talk about our mailbox archiving strategy. And to do so, we are first going to introduce the context on one has to consider when thinking about how we built our strategy. We will then focus on the strategy itself and how we have implemented it. And finally, we'd like to share with you the limits we faced, our experiments, and the reflections we've had. We'll be delighted to answer the questions you might have at the end of the presentation. But for now, it's up to you, André.
To start with, a few words on our institutional context. The Archives Nationales were created during the French Revolution to serve as a central repository for national archives. They are a national public service tasked with preserving, ordering, providing access to, and promoting public archives from the central administrations of state. So this includes the records of the presidents of the Republic, all the ministries, minus the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Economics and Finance. It also includes the records of high courts, the records of national operators, which are organisms tasked with a public service function, and the records of Paris notaries. They perform the same functions for private archives of national interest. They are housed on 2 sites, one here in Paris and one in Pierrefitte-sur-Seine, north of Paris. Within their digital support and preservation division, our department, the Department of Data Administration, is responsible for managing digital archives. We are a fairly small department with less than 10 people working on digital archives. The National Archives receive public archives through archivists working with central administrations within structures called archive missions. And between collecting these records and transferring those destined for definitive archiving for historical preservation to the National Archives, mission archivists appraise and arrange them, which means that the National Archives only perform these tasks when processing their own internal archives and private archives. So the missions are not subordinated to the National Archives, but overseen by the Interministerial Service of French Archives, the SIAF, and as such, they are actually on the same level as the National Archives within the French Public Archives network. For both public records and private archives of national interest, the National Archives mission is restricted to historical archiving, meaning that all records entering our archival holdings are meant to be preserved indefinitely.
We also have to consider the French legal and normative context in which we operate. In France, archives are regulated by the Code du patrimoine that we can translate as Code of Cultural Heritage, actually. It was published in 2004 and updated in 2008 for the archive section. It defines what archives are and what public archives are. And what is interesting is that the definition of archives include data. So simply put, archives are the document including data, whatever the date, whatever the support, whatever the form, and so on, that are created or received by a person or an organization. The Code du patrimoine also sets up the public access status. By principle, archives are opened for access, but delays may apply to protect the privacy and the safety of individuals or national security, for example. Concerning digital archiving, of course, in France as elsewhere, digital archiving relies on OAIS, but in France, we have another standard that is the NLZ 42013 relating to the specifications, both organizational and technical, of a digital repository. Archiving services that manage digital archives and digital archiving software programs use another standard, that is the CEDA, for data exchange and data exchange standard for archiving, sorry. And it could be considered as the French counterpart of METS, so it's XML based too, if I may try a comparison, but it's not exactly that. The first version of CEDA was published in 2006, and the last version, the CEDA 2.2, was released the last year in 2022. As for our technical context, these archives are preserved within a digital repository that is based on VITAM. VITAM is an open source software that was developed with the initial sponsorship of 3 ministries, the Ministry of Culture, on which depend the French National Archives, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Defense. Since the VITAM program has expanded to involve over 50 partners. The National Archive Digital Repository project was launched in 2015 as an answer to the increasing challenges of digital preservation. And the repository opened finally in November 2018. So it is based on VITAM as a back office, but it is interfaced with its own front office, that is the archival information system, the in-house archival information system, actually. Our digital repository is dedicated to long-term preservation of born digital archives only, so it includes digitized archives. I hope that we've made the context clearer. So now let's move on to the mailbox archiving strategy we have developed within this context. We're going to see where it fits in the overall evolution of data archiving at the National Archives, its goals, its principle, and its practical implementation.
And first, an overview of the evolution of digital archiving in general and mailbox archiving in particular at the National Archives. So the National Archives first started preserving digital archives in the early 80s using a method known as Constance. Constance is actually an acronym standing for preservation and storage of electronically created new archives. Is that right? This method can be seen as a prefiguration of OAIS, as it is based on the preservation of both data and its representation information. It also organizes the preservation of paper archives that were later digitized, paper documentation of these same digital archives. So data was stored on LTO tape, while metadata, including representation information, was stored in in-house databases. The first archives preserved using the Constance method were statistical data, but it was later expanded to an increasingly varied range of digital records, from databases to still and moving images, audio recordings, files created by word processing documents, spreadsheets, and so on. And the Constance method remained in use until the digital repository was launched in 2018. The National Archives started collecting mailboxes in 2017, so at a fairly recent date. As mentioned earlier, they are focused exclusively on definitive archiving. So the archives we receive have already been selected and assessed by archivists in the nations, and the National Archives only conduct these operations on mailboxes when collecting internally produced mailboxes, or when processing mailboxes that are included in private archives that we may acquire. So mailboxes are generally transferred to the digital repository from ministries' offices, along with other digital records. A majority of the mailboxes collected so far are in PST, as Outlook is widely used in the central administrations of state. We do have some Thunderbird mailboxes, so in Mbox, but so far only PST files have been ingested into the digital repository. Individual messages may also be preserved among other files from a given desktop, but the strategy we are focusing on today applies to mailboxes that are preserved in their entirety. While the first mailboxes were collected in 2017, this strategy was only developed in 2019. And since then, it has been applied to 40 PST extracted from 39 mailboxes. These are now preserved within the digital repository, and a stock of 95 PST files and 7 mailboxes in Mbox format still await migration to the digital repository.
We will now present you the mailbox archiving strategy itself, starting with its goals and then its principles. So the strategy has to ensure the preservation of messages of a mailbox, their arrangement, their metadata, or a selection of them at least, as well as their attachments. The strategy makes it possible to search and to find messages in the digital repository where they are displayed in a tree structure. In 2019, where we were thinking about building the strategy, we hadn't had any request for access yet. So the use cases we could beat were then only hypothetical. For this reason, and since mail archiving, as we know, is a very dynamic domain, there isn't really time-tested and time-grounded experience yet. The strategy leaves room for future options to represent archives outside the repository. So in order to reach these goals, I mean by that ensuring preservation on one hand and keeping options for several ways of representation in the other hand, the National Archives recommendation is to transfer each mailbox to the repository as a set of 2 SIPs. So the first SIPs contain the raw mailbox export in PST or Mbox format. And the second SIP contains the individual messages that have been extracted from the original mailbox and rendered in their original tree structure. The messages are both in EML format and text-plain format, with attachments extracted in the original format and linked to the messages in a tree structure, so on an intellectual level. The second SIP enables a long-term preservation without depending on the proprietary formats of the original extractions and makes content searchable and accessible in the digital repository.
And as for the practical implementation of this strategy, our main tool is RECIP. RECIP is an SIP preparation tool developed by the VTAM team, which allows us to extract and process a mailbox in order to obtain our preservation SIP. RECIP is used by archivists in missions and in the National Archives to process digital archives, including mailboxes, and to prepare SIPs before their ingest into our digital repository. It is available on the GitHub of the VTAM program. You have the link here on the slide. Mailbox extraction is one of the options provided under the importation dropdown menu in RECIP. And the setting windows, settings window for this option allows us to select the appropriate extraction protocol for the mailbox we want to process. In this example, a Thunderbird mailbox, and the default message encoding. It provides the option to generate a plain text version of the message bodies, which we select in accordance with our preservation strategy. It also provides options to generate a plain text version of the attachments, if applicable, and to extract textual metadata from messages and attachments. A window summarizes the process and results, and once the extraction and importation are complete, the mailbox contents are displayed in a tree structure view, with the root archive unit at the top here, along with a CSV file created by RECIP, which contains a list of the messages and the address book when applicable to the mailbox format. The interface is split into 3 panels. One on the left here, displaying the tree structure view, another on the top right, the descriptive and management metadata, and the last bottom right, the technical metadata. And to navigate from the metadata of an archive unit or object to another, we select the right level in the tree structure. So this here is the user-friendly view of the interface in French. And there is also an XML view displaying the SEDA tags, which are in English. For every extracted message, there is a mapping between the message metadata and the SEDA tags. So the subject, the sender, the addressee, the client ID of the message, etc. When selecting the archive unit of a message, the technical metadata panel here displays 2 objects, the EML version of the message and the text version of its body generated by RECIP. And as this message in particular had an attachment, there is a corresponding archive unit under its own. The attachment metadata has been mapped to SEDA tags here as well. And after the extraction, archivists can perform technical and archival pre-ingestion tasks, such as unzipping folders, deleting empty folders and files, deleting personal folders or messages, and so on. These eliminations, of course, must be documented in the custodial history of the root archival unit. And they are facilitated by tools provided by RECIP, such as warning for empty files, a search function, and a feature here to fuse duplicate objects. Before the extraction, RECIP can also be set up to exclude certain types of files according to our archival and file formats policy. So this can be done based on their name, so either their full name or a regular expression that might, for example, isolate the extension. So here, business cards, which are files with a VCF extension, logos in EMZ formats, or files with a DAT extension created following a message transmission error won't be imported. Once unwanted files have been eliminated, archivists can describe archive units at the relevant levels, so in general on high levels rather than on each individual message, of course. And the description metadata fields corresponding to SEDA tags can be added as needed. So here the description. Archive units can be ordered by selecting and dragging them in the tree structure panel. The message list CSV, along with a list of acronyms, if necessary, is also filed in an appendix folder. The last remaining step at this point in RECIP is to regenerate IDs for the archive units in order to match their new order in the SIP. Once this is done, we can export the SIP, which can then be transferred to the digital repository. A guidance sheet summarizing the step-by-step of this process has been created as a tool for mission archivists. And after preparing the two SIPs, archivists can ingest them into the digital repository in the same entry. And it is then possible to access both SIPs, so both the raw mailbox export and the individual messages from the mailbox exported as a tree structure through that same entry. And so this is the SIP of the raw PST export, which, as you can see, appears as a single archive unit with no hierarchy. And this here is the second SIP, which was processed in RECIP to extract individual messages and their attachments. And so here we have the option to display them in a tree structure. And here is the result for a part of the inbox folder. And last, in an appendix, as we mentioned earlier, the CSV files created by RECIP to list the messages and the calendar appointments here.
Well, in 3 years implementing this strategy, we have the opportunity to consider its limitations. And through experiments we performed following our first request for access on a mailbox, we also had the opportunity to reflect on further prospects. So first, limitations. We can't underestimate the fact that implementing this strategy involves a lot of work for the archivist who has to process the mailboxes. We are completely aware of that. Besides, in the ministry, the National Archives do not handle the export of mailboxes. It's up to the mission archives and their IT service. So we don't take part of the exports. The strategy, as you've seen, relies on a tool that is RECIP, and therefore the successful importation of the mailbox in it. It can be quite slow to import a mailbox depending on the size of the mailbox or the number of messages we have to extract. And concerning the errors, the importation process actually stops as soon as an error occurs. So many errors can prevent the importation of mailboxes in RECIP, unfortunately. And therefore, archivists must report and discuss importation issues with the RECIP team. That can be quite difficult sometimes because it means that the RECIP team has to get an authorization to access the mailbox and then analyze it to fix the issue. To give you a concrete example, we had problems when extracting messages where there were typos in the addressee that made them ill-formed. Due to this problem, the mailbox couldn't be imported at all in RECIP. After we reported the issue to the RECIP team, they get an authorization to access the mailbox and they could analyze it and then fix it in a new version of RECIP, but it took few months. Regarding the size now, at this time, we haven't yet encountered really big mailboxes, but we are aware that processing mailboxes bigger than 30 gigabytes will be very time consuming. Why? Because in our digital repository, there is a limitation that and the archivist mission can't today transfer SIP that are bigger than 30 gigabytes. So it's very important. It's not really for mailboxes. It's really for every type of archives we want to ingest in the digital repository. But it's important because that means that the archive mission needs to pay attention to the size of the exports when they ask them. So a single mailbox can be exported in several segments, and in that case, each segment can be prepared and transferred in its own SIP. After ingest, now we have so experienced difficulties when it comes to rendering some anti-extracted mailbox in the digital platform. As with every archival holding that have been ingested in a digital repository, regardless of the nature, mailboxes, their messages, and the attachments can be accessed in a tree view, as André showed us. But there are limitations on this tree view, in particular for displaying high numbers of messages contained in the same folder. Therefore, roughly organized mailboxes can cause problems, and in that cases, I must admit that tree structure is not really suitable. Since last year, new experiments and reflections have taken place due to our first request for access on a mailbox. Let me give you some details about this request. First, it involved a mailbox that in the French legislative context is not freely accessible yet. Actually, the same would be accurate for every mailbox we've collected, since there is a delay of 50 years before these records become opened for access, following the Code du patrimoine. Requests on mailboxes therefore require a specific authorization, and prior to this authorization, archivists must be able to investigate the presence of sensitive contents, personal information in the mailboxes, as well to ensure that mailbox contents are truly relevant to the requests. This mailbox hadn't been processed to enter the digital repository, and when we wanted to do so, despite several attempts, unfortunately, we couldn't import the mailbox in RECIP, and we couldn't ingest it in our digital repository. So I'm describing a very specific use case, but it has led us to experiment with other tools, so that is a good side. What did we know about this mailbox? We knew that it was exported in 4 PST files, representing a total size of 9 gigabytes. And we knew who the holder of the mailbox was, but we didn't know how many messages there were. To learn about this mailbox, and as a part of investigating the access authorization, we performed tests using RATOM and EPAT+. First, thanks to RATOM, we converted the 4 PST files in one SQLite file, and we were able to determine that there were around 95,000 messages and 45,000 attachments. Where we could access the message bodies in RATOM, we couldn't access the attachments themselves. However, it was a first step and quite a big one, because we could query the messages headers and bodies, and we could start the investigation. What we found was the number of messages that were likely to answer the request was too large. It represented about half the entire mailbox, and it would have been too time consuming to really assess the actual relevance to the request. It appears that somehow the request was too vague. Besides, this large amount of messages made sensitivity checking quite impossible. So we also tried EPAT+ with an email chemistry trial license at first, but the results were quite similar. The queries provided a large number of messages, but this time we could access the attachments. We enjoyed testing EPAT so much that we made further tests with other mailboxes that we had in inbox formats to try the appraisal model. We haven't experimented the other ones at that time, but we plan to this summer. Nevertheless, our little experience has led us to report to EPAT's GitHub 2 issues, and they were fixed very quickly. Concerning other tools, we had a presentation of a pell-mell tool, but we haven't found time to go further yet. The investigation of the mailboxes of this mailbox, for which we had a request, didn't allow us to go further in practice because the access request was finally denied. But this request and the experiments we performed enabled us to broaden our reflection to regular use cases. And I mean by that, mailboxes that could be processed in RECIP and ingested in our digital repository. And we ask ourselves some questions. First, what is the most effective way to perform this investigation of sensitive content and content that is relevant to the request? is it best to search directly to the mailbox container after using a tool that can properly render it? And this question leads to another one. To what extent must we use for access reason Outlook or Thunderbird, for example? Are their search engine really effective? Are they trustworthy? Or is the best option to investigate using a kind of finding head, such as the CSV5, the list of messages that we could have in receipt? Or is it best to search directly through the digital repository in the extracted messages, as we can do today? And what about searching in the attachments and how to manage it? Beyond the best way to investigate access authorization, the questions of how to actually give researchers access to a mailbox remains for us open. Should it be accessible as an entire container or as a collection of messages? But how can we make this collection? Which format should we use and what should we do with the attachments? Here, we think that maybe the discovery model of EPAT can bring answer, but we have to try it. Discussing the request all the partners had, it appears that a lot of them concern an entire mailbox or even a set of mailboxes among other records in the same request. So it can possibly give a lot of work for the archivist who has to investigate the requests. For example, a request could be, I'd like to have access to all the messages that tackle the questions of this and that in the mailboxes of so and so. Often, investigations lead to refuse access for authorization, as we did ourselves. In that case, the researchers can appeal against the decision to a commission, that is the CADA for administrative records access. In previous cases, this commission has noted the difficulty in processing mailboxes and has taken that into account when rejecting the requests.
So regarding access, we don't have answers yet, as we have only received one access request so far. However, this is only a beginning, and we might receive more soon, whether from researchers or from the archive producers themselves, or even legal authorities. What our strategy does provide is the space to consider potential answers, as there might be a plurality of answers depending on the context, the specifics, and the author of the requests. So it is particularly important to leave options open, and the strategy could then evolve and be adapted to the actual requests. Thank you for your attention. We'll now do our best to answer your questions. I see that you already have a few. And we are looking forward to any comments you might have as well.
Thank you.
Well, and I'd also like to thank both of you for an excellent presentation. Really interesting for me to see the ways you've both confronted some of the same problems that we see in most other email collections, and the specific ways you've tried to fit them, and in fact have fit them in with the existing tools you have, such as RECIP. So really interesting. Also appreciate the experimentation you did with both RATOM and EPAD, and wish you kind of the best of luck with that as well.
Thank you.
I do have a couple questions here, as you both noted. So one question we have, and maybe it's perhaps a point of clarification, but it sounds like you maintain both the original PST file that has not been processed or curated, as well as the curated one or processed one, which is a subset of the original, thereby keeping some messages that the archivist determined should be discarded. So could you speak to that a little bit and maybe offer some additional context?
Well, that is true. The PST is uncurated, so this is really the raw export from the client. And for the mailbox that is processed with receipt, it's really the archivist in the mission that has to process and assess. We can eliminate the messages he doesn't want to ingest in our digital repository. It's really up to the archivist and mission. We don't have anything to say about that.
Right. And so it sounds like at the end of the process, what's preserved in the repository is what the archivist in the mission has determined saved, and then the original PST is not ingested into the repository.
Yeah, because we think that it's maybe dangerous to process mailboxes directly in Outlook or in the client in general. So we prefer the raw exports without any touching.
Right, right. Sounds like a good strategy to me, and I think very consistent with what most other archives are doing as well. And then another question, and maybe again, this is a little bit hard to say because I understand the mission archivists are responsible for this, but it says the question from Susan is, do the mission archivists handle attachments that are links to a document management system? Perhaps that would be handled in export services so that you get the actual document. So I think that's really a question about attachments that are in the email itself, as opposed to ones that might be links to documents that are not embedded in the email, but found in a different system. So do you, as part of your process, have a way to handle those types of linked documents as well?
Well, not on the level of the file. We have linked between the mailbox and the desktop, for example, that could be ingested in our digital repository, but there isn't a link between an attachment and maybe a file that have been ingested in a desktop holding, for example. So it's at the high level, but not on the level file. Right.
Yeah. No, and I think that's an interesting problem that we come up with a lot of email archives efforts now as well, because when the files are kept somewhere else but referenced in the email, they might be very important for the context of the message. But the two systems are disconnected, right? And then we also have one other question here from Claudia. Did you encounter problems with the evaluation of EPAD because the emails are in French, obviously, and EPAD can identify entities that are designed for English-speaking regions. So it's the language issue in essence. Was EPAD able to identify some of those entities that were in French, you know, the names, the places, what have you?
Yeah. That's really interesting because the first problem we had with EPAD was importation and file the name of folders in French because some characters were not properly extracted, and we could see that not all the folders were extracted in EPAD. So that's one of the issues we reported to the GitHub, to EPAD's GitHub, and then it was fixed. So we could we can now extract every folder of a mailbox, even in French, but they are in French. So that's a good thing. And concerning the entities, well, for location and name of person, it wasn't too bad, actually. We were quite surprised in a good way.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I mean, I haven't experimented with EPAD in a language other than English, but I do certainly get the sense it's extensible to other entities as well, because it uses a general language model.
It was really good, actually.
That's great. That's really wonderful to hear. I was interested in your, I'll be interested in the future to hear how your experimentation goes with the EPAD discovery module, because I'm wondering, you know, if that might help quite a bit to narrow some of the requests down, because I know when I've looked at it in the past, it does provide a more limited subset of emails potentially that would be responsive to a particular access request without providing the entire message as a whole. So I'll be interested to see if it provides an interesting sort of back and forth there between the researcher and the person reviewing the access request. It sounds like your first attempts, you had such a large corpus that were responsive that it really did become overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of overwhelming, but we haven't said that in France, we have to bring an answer to a special authorization within 2 months. So it's
2 months.
so we had really few times to test new tools. So that's why we haven't gone further yet. Maybe
Certainly.
this summer we have to try some things.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot to dig into there.
Yeah.
So we do have a few minutes left. I'll just ask if there are other questions from the attendees. We have quite a few people listening online here, so I would just encourage anyone to add additional questions in. And I see we do have a couple of other comments now. So Florian is speaking from the German side and noting that they also encountered inaccuracies and mistakes for entity recognition and lexicon terms, but that's to be expected. I think that's a valuable comment, and thank you for that, Florian. And then, as Jessica noted, 50 to 60,000 emails maybe contains many non-records, materials that might have been weeded out as non-record materials, your personal types of things, or things that are so trivial that they normally wouldn't require retention. So the question is, how is the French National Archives working with digital curation at the beginning of the life cycle? So that may be a little bit hard to answer again, because maybe that happens more in the missions, but
yeah, it's really up to the mission. So we don't work at the beginning of the life cycle, and yeah, it makes digital preservation really a difficult task, because we are at the end of the life cycle, actually. So that's really a challenge for us. But it's really the mission who has to give good practice for the management of mailboxes, but we don't do that.
Right, and that's a common challenge. I think every organization has certainly confronted that challenge. We've, in our own, if I can just talk for a minute, our own institution here has provide that kind of guidance to records creators to help them manage their email, along the lines of the types of things, in fact, that Jessica was talking about yesterday, the email management challenges, smallest inbox contest, whatever you want to call it, but it's a perennial challenge, certainly, because of the nature of the format. So we are close to the end of our time here. I'd like to thank you both so much for telling us about the French context and for all of the efforts that you've made. I really love the way you're integrating email processing and preservation in with the systems that you have, as well as the experimentation with other tools. I think it's, I'll be interested to follow in the future and see the ways in which those experiments go. But again, just lots of thanks from us here in Illinois and from all of our attendees for your time here with us, and hope you can catch some of the rest of the symposium. Again, thank you, and we will see all of you back here, hopefully at the top of the hour, 9 a.m. Central Time, with our next presentation, which is from Sharon McKeegan at the Digital Preservation Coalition. See you all soon.
Thank you again.